Well, Grand Designs is one of my favourite TV shows. I was chatting to some people about it last week. It seems to be that watching people put themselves through pain for greater pleasure is something I enjoy doing. But when it comes to a house and building your dream home, if you like, it actually says something about who we are. There's something about what we value. There's something that's really human and deeply personal about the places that we live in or what we make of them. And today, the title for our message today is The Sure Hope of Home. Yet, being well versed in watching this show, I know that there's blood and sweat and tears go into building your own home. Maybe you have had that experience of building a home or building something substantial with your hands. Sometimes people will even live for a little while on site while their home is being built. They might live in a caravan. They might live in a mobile home, squeezed in for a little time in the hope of what's coming. And I imagine what helps them do that is that they can see progress. They can see the house coming up. They can see the plans. They can see what it's going to be like. And that helps them for a short time to live with that discomfort, to be squeezed. I suppose building a house is the ultimate example of delayed gratification. Fancy term, but really it's the idea of short-term pain for long-term gain. And it's a quality that we all need to grow in. So you might be in your younger years and thinking, I'm not building houses yet. But this is a quality that still brings us hope and helps us keep going. So maybe on sunny days like this, you choose to study for the good that it brings rather than a sunny day with friends. Or maybe you choose to save your money rather than constantly tapping your Revolut and spending it on nice things. Maybe you push through and you do the exercise, even though you just couldn't flat be bothered doing it today because of the reward that it'll bring. You feel better in yourself, you feel stronger and fitter. Abraham actually was well versed in this quality. In Hebrews 11 verse 9 we read, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents. Present pain. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. There was future gain. Abraham made his home in the promised land, but he's looking to a forever home beyond. And the same should be true of us as Christians. We make our home here in this world. We live in it here and now for Christ. And yet we remember that this isn't our forever home. We're on our way to heaven, if you like, or to the home that is a new heaven and new earth that God is making in the end. But when we lose sight of this, we lose some of our strength as Christians. J.I. Packer said this as far back as 1987. He said this, we have cast Christianity into a mold that stresses happiness over holiness, blessings here rather than blessings hereafter, health and wealth is God's best gifts, and death, especially early death, not as a deliverance from the miseries of a sinful world, but as the supreme disaster. I wonder, does that connect with you or challenge you? He's saying we've made ourselves too much at home here. We desperately need a faith that shifts us to the future. We need a faith that is a sure hope of home. Well, as we go after it this morning, we're going to follow in the footsteps of Abraham. And as we begin chapter 13, actually, we see him finding his way back home. Where has he been? Firstly, this morning, faith is the sure hope of home. It repents and returns. If you've your Bible open in front of you there in verses 1 to 4 of Genesis 13, you'll see that he makes his way home. Last week we left him in the Negev in the south of Canaan. But if you look back into chapter 12 and verse 10 there was a severe famine in the land and he makes a move again, but this time he goes to Egypt in search of help. And even though God had commanded him to go to this land, he promised to give it to him, to bless him, Abraham strays outside its borders. He takes matters into his own hands. He leaves the promises behind for a while. Rather than trust God to protect him, here's a good story for you. He took his wife and pretended that she was his sister for a while. Whoops. In case he got in trouble because others would be attracted to her and want her. He hides, if you like. And Pharaoh indeed did take her to be wife. And God steps in to protect Abram. He sends illnesses on Pharaoh's house. And Pharaoh's only too happy to get rid of them in the end. God protects Abraham when he was seeking to protect himself. And he's seeking provision in Egypt. He's seeking food for his family. But God graciously blesses him, even when he's off course. In verse 2 of chapter 13, we read that Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. He was heavy with riches. He has sought to provide for himself, but God has graciously provided for him, even when he's off course. And yet, do you remember last time Abraham and his family were to be a blessing to all the nations? Well, the nation of Egypt weren't blessed by Abraham's actions. He's not off to a great start here. He's pretty far from the promises of God. And yet, he's making his way home. He recognizes it. He repents. And in the language of the Bible, to repent is to turn back to God, to come back home to him. Now, maybe you're thinking, what kind of hero is this? Sometimes that passage we read last week and we've quoted from this morning, Hebrews 11, is called heroes of faith. They're examples of faith to us. Well, Abram's definitely there. He has faith. He's called the pioneer of faith, or the father of faith, but he's not perfect. And in fact, real faith is imperfect. If you know what it's like to turn from God and to take things into your own hands, take heart. There's a way back. Real faith is a work in progress. Whether you've grown up in church environments where you've got the message of what God expects of you, but have maybe tended to forget that message of how gracious he is to you, so you end up being hard on yourself because you're not living up to expectations. Or maybe you're on a faith journey coming home to God from keeping your distance from him. My prayer is that this church might be a place where you can come back to him. This might be a place of grace where we all extend each other a little bit of room to grow, a little bit of understanding that we all go astray at times. We all miss the mark. But we could come back to our gracious God together. Faith is the sure hope of home, secondly, because it gives generously. In verses 5 to 13. In verses 5 to 7 here we see that Abram may be heavy with riches, but he's not the only one. Lot was his nephew, and up until now Lot's just gone along with his uncle. But Lot has got his own flocks and herds and tents, and they're both taking up space. They're squeezed and they're fighting over the head of it. There's not enough room about here for both of us. The herdsmen, their workers were fighting with each other. And it's not helped by the fact that they're in the land of Canaanites and Perizzites. It's all congested. The land that God had promised has failed Abram once already, if you like. There's been a famine. And he chose to leave. Now it's failing him again. There's no room for him to live. Is he going to stay? Or will he go? Well, Abram's the more senior of the two here, and he takes the initiative. He takes the initiative. But did you notice what he does in verses 8 and 9? He doesn't tell Lot what to do. He doesn't grab the land for himself. He values peace with his family above getting the best land. He says to Lot, we are kin. As the more senior, he could have grabbed the best for himself and told Lot where to go. But actually, he gives ground here. He doesn't claim ground. He gives it. He says to Lot, you choose first. He gives up his rights. In verses 10 and 11, well, what does Lot do? He has a good look around him, and he sees the good land. The fertile valley, described as being like Eden garden in the beginning, picture perfect, or also described like being like Egypt, which throughout the book of Genesis is a rich source of provision and of food and of bread. And what does he choose? Well, he chooses the good land for himself. No considering his uncle's care for him thus far and saying, no, uncle, actually, you're the senior, you've looked after me, after you, uncle. No chance, he grabs it. You might be sensing trouble, because as beautiful as this land is, when you look at verses 10 to 11, it's described as being before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. There's judgment coming on this area. The two men parted company, verses 12 and 13, to different places. Abram is still in the promised land, even though it's not as fertile. Lot is beyond its bounds. He pitches his tent near Sodom, and there's a world of difference between them. Maybe this helps you just in table form to see the difference between these two men. It's not just different places, is it? They're different people at this time. Abram is generous, where Lot is selfish. Abram seeks harmony and values it. Lot seeks prosperity. Abram is with God in his land. Lot chooses to go without him. Abram is looking to a future, and Lot just wants things now. Abram knew God had promised him the land. He trusted God to provide for him. Even though it seemed harder and full of other people, he was squeezed, it was subject to famine, things were pretty sketchy and precarious. He knew that that kind of place where God wanted him to be, was the better place to be, even though it was uncomfortable, because he looked forward with hope. Lot, in fact, we can hear the hints of it, can't we, in those verses, is headed towards disaster. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed because of their great sin. He forgets the future implications of his present decisions. We'll do the spoiler alert. Lot escapes. We're not going to land in that story. He does escape, but he's far too close to what's going on there. Abram, however, has a sure hope of a future home. He trusted God to look after him. He learned from God, who'd been so gracious to him in Egypt, that he can be good to others. He gives up on his rights. He generously shows generosity. Wonder, does it remind you of another who would come from Abraham? Jesus, who came to us, who gave up his rights for us, who generously gave to others. When we set our gaze on what God is providing for us in the future home we have, we can view material things here and now very differently. We can hold them lightly and be willing to share them with others. So let me challenge you today and ask you today, what are you doing with your money? With the things in your possession? Because that says something about the value you place on them. Are we giving to others? Are we hanging on for ourselves? Or if you find yourself in a position at the moment where money is difficult, are you making it more difficult than it needs to be because you're bemoaning the loss of it as if everything depended on it? And I don't say that without sympathy, by the way. But I do say it knowing that money is not the centre of our lives. Faith and generosity go hand in hand. When we trust God for what he will bring us in the future, it means we can be open-handed with what we have in the present. He will provide for us so we can give to others. Faith is the sure hope of home. Thirdly, in faithful following in verses 14 to 18. Before Abram can even regret his decision or think, am I mad to stay here? God speaks. Perfect timing. God reminds him of the promise, refreshes it, maybe even expands it here. And so we see that in verses 14 to 16. Just what he needed, that encouragement. In verse 10, Lot had looked around, but verse 14, Abram is called to look all around you. Verse 11, Lot had seen the whole plain of Jordan. But in verse 14, Abram is told to see all the land I will give you. Rather than grab the land, Abram is given it by God. The promises here are the same as before of a land and of people in chapter 12, and yet they're expanded. The land is to the north, south, east, and west. His offspring are like the dust. So great they will be. So in verse 18 he goes and he lives near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents, and he builds an altar to the Lord. He makes his home there. He builds an altar there, and that's where he bases himself for most of his story. And that word Mamre means fatness. It means abundance, blessing. Abram is now living, literally, you know the way some people choose house names and they have a significance to them? Well, Abram is now living in God's blessing. That's interesting, isn't it? Even though it mightn't have looked like it in terms of how the land was in that moment. It's in this area later that he buys a cave to bury Sarah, his wife. And in chapter 23, when Sarah dies, that's the only land he owns in that whole land yet. He certainly hasn't taken possession of the land. It's a small start, but he's chosen to live there. And in Hebrews 11 and 13, thinking of Abram, I think, the writer says this: all these people were living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show they're looking for a country of their own. If they'd been thinking of the country they'd left, they would have opportunity to return. Instead, they're longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. It was all ahead of Abraham. For those of us today with faith in Jesus, it's all ahead of us. He looked forward to his inheritance as to a city with sure foundations, even though he lived in a tent. We look forward with confidence to our inheritance with Jesus. A confidence and inheritance, we're told in 1 Peter 1, our inheritance can never perish, spoil, or fade. It's secure and safe. Abram's looking forward meant he could be faithful in the here and now. His hope filled him with faithfulness. Perhaps your tent is pitched in a difficult place at the moment in life. When we find ourselves in these tight spots, in these difficult places, in places of hurt even, hope can be a real help to us. Just as, again, if you're younger and you think of your exams, you might have a reward at the end of them you can look forward to, or holidays after a season of hard work, or fitness or feeling better in yourself after rhythms of exercise. The kind of gratification that's anticipated can help us, even if it's delayed, and be more meaningful and substantial for it when we receive it. Abram needed God to remind him of the promise because his current surroundings were hard. When we think of houses and buildings at the moment, I wonder what you're building, what you're putting your hands to, and how the renewed hope of home with the Lord might breathe new life into you in that. What about the people around you, the relationships we're building? How might God's hope breathe life into that for you? For some of you, I know you're thinking of a home to call your own. You want to build a home for yourself where your family might live. How might God's hope and God's home influence that and encourage you? For some here, you're looking for a job or a purpose to put your hands to sink yourself into. How might the hope of home with the Lord influence that decision now and encourage us? Even as we wait for home, it can be good to remember that God is making something of us. In fact, God is making a home of us in which He will dwell Himself. So when things get hard and we think, what is God doing? Why is He doing this to me? Well, imagine yourself a living house, C.S. Lewis would say. Let me read this quote to you as we finish. Imagine yourself a living house when God comes to rebuild that house. At first, perhaps you can understand what He's doing. He's getting the drains right. He's stopping the leaky roof. You knew those jobs needed doing. You're not surprised. But then He starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts. It doesn't seem to make any sense. What is He up to? The explanation is that He's building quite a different house from the one you thought of. He's throwing out a new wing there. He's putting on an extra floor. He's running up towers. He's making courtyards. You thought you were going to be made into a decent little cottage. But He's building something much grander. He's building a palace in which He intends to come and live Himself. And Lewis says that of our individual lives, but imagine that just of our church family and what God might do with us. Imagine that what He might do with His church in this land and across the world today, that He might expand who we are, just as He did with Abraham here. That He might give us that hope, but He might expand us so that His kingdom might come, that we might be generous and faithful.